Welcome to Medicine Redefined. I'm Dr. Altamash Raja.
And I'm Dr. Darsh Shah. Let's put the health back in healthcare.
If you're a high performer who wants a clear plan for longevity, performance, and staying active with fewer setbacks, I'm now seeing patients through my telemedicine practice refining health and performance. I'm opening a limited number of founding member spots at refininghealthrx.com. All right, let's jump in.
Hey, Casey, thanks so much for coming on to Medicine Redefined.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with both of you.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you connected with me on Instagram. Going through your profile, I think there's just a lot of profound quotes that you put on there that make the viewer think and have a lot of introspective thoughts. And so I think this episode would be awesome if we can go through some of those quotes and we'll kind of just have a discussion about those. So to start off, you wrote, "You don't find peace by becoming untouchable. You find it by letting life touch you deeply and staying open anyway." Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think it sort of touches on vulnerability and getting to what I call like the juicy fruit in life, right? It's not about it's not about perfection. It's not about all the compensatory strategies that we could do to create barriers to our authentic and most raw experience, but it's really about peeling those away so that we can really get to the most rich layer of our being and really experience life from that kind of heart-opening, heart-centered place and connecting with people there. I don't know about you guys, but that's where I want to live from and meet people and know others. And so that's my work. That is, to me, the aim, the desire, the goal in all relationships.
Yeah, I think a lot of that for me comes down to almost what I call seeking the truth. And this term mysticism has come up. And actually the first time I heard it was on a YouTube blogger's video saying that she believes in mysticism. And at first listen, I was like, what does that mean? That's just woo, right? Whatever. But then when you actually look into the definition of it, I'll let you explain too what mysticism is. I started to realize that I found myself aligning more with that and with my spiritual journey. So if you don't mind just telling our listeners a little bit about what is mysticism?
I think it's the great mystery, right? But it's this quality and how do we connect with, and so this is not at all an official definition, but if I just speak from what it is to me, right? It's how do we palpate with our real human physical selves and how do we palpate the mystery, the great mystery in life and what is unknown and have an intersection of those two. And I think of that as being the ephemeral, right? And how palpable and real that world is if we allow ourselves to engage with it and be curious, right? Because if we limit ourselves, I think about limitation even of just our human experience, our minds, whatever layers of our being that would be, and I'm always wanting to push those limits and understand what's next, what's beyond that, what don't I already know, what is in the unknown, how do I build a relationship with that rather than certainty, which makes so many of us comfortable, but truly it's that familiar has a ceiling to it. It's limited and it confines us. And so I think of mysticism really as our ability to have a relationship with that unknown, with the mystery, with whatever lives beyond that in our faith and our truth. And what that is for each and every one of us is going to be a personal journey. But developing that relationship is, I think, one of the greatest things we can do for ourselves to expand our consciousness, expand our experience, and live in a more expanded way. How about for you? What's been your experience?
I'll get to that in a second, but I actually want to explore this word vulnerable a little bit more. You're talking about curiosity, you're talking about connecting, and you led, at least the first part of the question that Darsh had asked you led with the word vulnerable. And I'm wondering why that's important. Why did you start there?
I think, it's again, we're so conditioned unconsciously, subconsciously. What we do to protect ourselves is we build up compensatory strategies to not really be our true selves, to not really feel the pain of the world, whatever that pain is. We build up strategies to avoid that connection with ourself. It's like, okay, well, I only have a certain experience that I want to allow in and have, and those can only be positive ones. They can't be painful ones. And so it's a subconscious thing that the mind, the nervous system does to protect us from feeling pain, essentially. But What we need to do is peel back all that is and really get to these vulnerable spots. So for me, vulnerability is like, am I willing to look at all of it? It's not just the good parts. It's not just the fun parts. It's not just the pleasant parts. It's not just the ones that feel good or make me comfortable, but it's the breadth of the entire experience, right? And so we have to be really vulnerable to dare to do that, because it's going to be inherently uncomfortable to push ourselves to that next level to experience it all. And frankly, that's what healing is. Really, it's allowing in what we've rejected or blocked or avoided so that we can really understand and meet whatever that pain point is in a way that would actually be truly serving to whatever the pain point is. And so whether that's physical, whether that's mental, whether that's emotional, whether that's spiritual, the truth is the same, right? We have to go into it in order to really transcend it.
Wow, a lot to follow up on that. Let me start with this.
Yep.
You're mentioning compensatory strategies, and I'm first wondering if that's necessarily a bad thing. But let me tell you, a quote from Tim Ferriss actually comes to mind, where he was talking about the optimizer's curse, or maybe even the problem solver's curse, that if you're constantly being rewarded for problem solving in your life, you eventually start finding problems even when problems don't exist, because you're so good at that, right? You're rewarded. And I imagine that this is the case for a lot of high performing folks, right? So Darsh and I have been talking a lot about high performance. We're talking to Jade Wu about high performing sleep. And that's like an internal reward that you get when you're constantly looking for a problem, you're solving it, you get that dopamine that you're looking for the next one. Externally, you're rewarded as well. For instance, somebody who's a workaholic is constantly being rewarded by getting a raise at work, getting promotions. And that's looked at something to be, it's admirable, right? They're grinding. I know that we've been having this conversation for the last 5 to 10 years in terms of, hey, maybe it's not always go. Sometimes you just got to get in cruise control, or maybe even just park the car. Yet there's still lots of people who will say you just gotta keep grinding. For instance, this is something that I struggle with reconciling so much. So I think about, I've used Kobe Bryant over and over again. Kobe Bryant, Alex Hormozy, these folks who say that 3 practices aren't enough. You got to do the 4th practice. You got to do the 100th presentation before you're ready for your final presentation. And then it's the opposite of that is what you're talking about, is learning to sit with ourselves gently, right? And with curiosity instead of control, you mentioned once, and then you begin to shift. You start finding peace rather than chasing peace. You start cultivating peace, you talked about. And I'm just wondering, is for somebody who's constantly internally and externally rewarded for their entire life, how can that person even begin to think about sitting and quietly being vulnerable with themselves? Because it's painful. It's so painful. Why not just keep chasing the busyness and aesthetic, to steal something from Chris Williamson, because you're going to be rewarded, you're going to be successful outwardly. And then the second part of that question was like, where's the balance? Like, how does somebody find the balance? I keep going back and forth, and I'm not really sure where to land on this one. I know that there's a lot there.
Yeah, there is a lot there. And really the question is anyone's drive and success and accomplishment, because I work with typically also highly driven, highly successful individuals as well, is a problem. Like really that question, whether it's addiction or anything else that we could look at, and workaholism can be an addiction. Is it creating a problem in your life? And that's really the threshold in which you can gauge and understand, okay, is this problematic or is my life fine? Am I really successful at making money, but I have barriers to relationships, or there's some part of my life that's not balanced or fulfilled in some way? And if the answer to that is no, there's not a problem, and it's not disrupting my life in some way, it's not disrupting some arena of my life in some way, then carry on. Who's to say that's a broken system and that it's not working for you? But what I tend to find is people who have been highly successful in many arenas of their life, specifically professionally and financially, but there's some part of their life that there is unfulfilled. That's generally relationships, or maybe it's their spiritual self, or there's something that is unfulfilled for them. And so whatever that is, it doesn't matter. But if you can look at it and say, everything's pretty good except for this one thing, or I still have a longing over here, but I don't know how to fix that, then sometimes those compensatory strategies, we have to look at them and say, yes, this has been highly adaptive for me, and I've been rewarded internally and externally for this strategy. But is it become maladaptive in some arena in my life? And so I think that's the question. And if it's become maladaptive in some arena in my life, if you keep pushing in that trajectory, then you'll probably just, when you do what you did, you'll get what you got, right? You'll get more of the same, probably same success. But again, are other things starting to falter and fail? And so I think we are also biopsycho individual, and we have to consider that. And we have to really listen and ask not questions that are generalized, I think, because what applies to either one of you or me or Alex Ramosi or Tim Ferriss or anyone who might give that direction to just do one more, add to the routine and be disciplined and keep focused and do the next thing. That may work for a lot of people as long as there's not a disruption that it's causing in some arena of your life. And so I think that's the thing you really want to ask yourself is, can I be and live fully fulfilled here? Or is there a longing or an arena of my life that I'm ignoring, that I'm avoiding, that's untouched, that's out of balance, essentially, to use your word. And if it is, then people usually come to me when they've been highly successful with many things, but they are missing something, that they're a barrier, meaning the compensatory strategy that they've adapted is not serving them in this way. They cannot apply that strategy. So they have to, and maybe it's sitting and being quiet with themselves and being vulnerable with themselves. Maybe it's doing it with a therapist or a guide or somebody. I don't know what that would be. We would have to unpeel that and understand what's in the way, because if the strategy that's highly serving you in other arenas of your life is not serving you in this one arena, then we probably need to go in and figure out what the barrier is. That might be a subconscious one, that might not, the application of that particular strategy or solution simply won't work. And so they'll keep running up against a wall. And so we might need to peel it back and go inside of it and allow ourselves to feel a pain point of whatever it originally was or whatever it became along the way, to understand it so that we can have more balance and peace in our life. Does that answer your question?
It does. I want to, just because we're talking about contemplating, I want to push back a little bit. And I'm also wondering if that maladaptive thing that you're talking about with respect to just maybe one facet of your life, if that's almost a necessary cost to pay for being great, for being legendary. So I know, Darsh, you don't know a lot about his sleep habits, but Musk is notorious for his, like, in terms of family, right? I don't think that anybody would look and be like, okay, that's admirable. And I listen to some of these podcasters. I listened a lot to Stephen Bartlett, who talks about all these billionaires he knows and millionaires he knows, and they're quote unquote not happy because they've sacrificed time with their kids and this and that. And I'm thinking about a LinkedIn post by a physician colleague who posted maybe a month ago, where he was calling out some other physician's post where the physician had written something about, if you get sick, your employer is going to find another person. Your patients are going to find another doctor, and so on and forth. We've all heard these things, but who's not going to be able to move on is going to be your kids and your wife and your parents and that stuff. Mm-hmm. And this colleague who had reposted it was saying that maybe that's not necessarily all true. Like, he was actually saying that he does have to sacrifice his kids. He does have to sacrifice his family because being a physician is a calling. Now, right. Darsh and I typically, I agree with that, but I also don't. I think that medicine today is different, right? But those are my personal thoughts. But also got me thinking. I actually responded to him, said, hey, that post isn't for you. It's for maybe 20 other people, but you are not that person. You're the exception, not the rule. It's when people are making these decisions, sacrifices on things that actually matter to them. They say that they're their priorities, their family's a priority, their fitness, their health is a priority, yet their actions say otherwise. Those are the people that's talking to. It's not necessarily you, because your priorities are aligned. So all that to say is, when I think about these people who've changed the world, they've been impactful to a degree where their work has touched millions of lives for the better. Yep. I almost wonder if it's a cost that has to be paid. And I don't know, because I don't know the other side of the coin on that. And I'm also not one of those people. But since you do see a lot of folks at that level, I'm wondering, do you know a lot of people who are at that success level and have made that type of difference and are also have it all figured out, so to speak?
Yeah, great question. So I'll do my best to answer it, but I love the pushback and the challenge. That's what makes good conversation. So I'm grateful for your question. I think of it, you actually already touched the heart of really what I would say about that, which is, for me, making people super conscious of what their value systems are is really important. We can't separate those two. And when we're not conscious and aligned, to use your word, which is exactly the word that I would use, but when we're not congruent with those, with our conscious ideal value systems, then we will not see ourselves clearly. We will not make decisions that bring us into alignment. And so again, that is so bio, psycho, spiritually individual to each person, that each of our value systems, none of us are going to have exactly the same. And I don't know two people on the planet that will have exactly the same alignment in value systems, because when needs compete, when two values are on the same rung, meaning I almost see them in a ladder and a hierarchy, and truly each and every one of us has a system that is our ideal system, meaning we're aligned and congruent with that system. When we envision our highest self, our reality would line up and be perfectly congruent with that. That's what health and well-being and really enlightenment is, when those two things line up. Most people don't have them that line up. And it's also then this other question of, okay, so if somebody has a high value, and so when our reality is incongruent with that ideal system, that's when people are coming to therapy. That's when people are unwell physically. That's when people really need to move to bring those things into alignment. And frankly, what I love about coaching people around that is a lot of it is very low hanging fruit. Sometimes we just didn't know how, in contrast to ourselves, how contrary we were to our own value systems, because we hadn't gotten super conscious about what they were and the particular hierarchy of those systems. So all of that to then circle back, that's some of the most important work you can do from the get-go when you start doing this work, especially at a high level, because most people are pretty aligned, or else they wouldn't be as highly successful as they've come to be. However, there may, again, be these elements that are not. And so we explore what the barriers to that success might be and why they're not able to get congruent with those systems. Then to answer your question, if somebody is doing something in a super great, influencing millions, making a difference in the world, having this higher calling, I would agree with you. It probably is exactly that. But inside, again, are they congruent? Would they decide that this is the hierarchy and this is the sacrifice that I'm willing to make? They may resoundingly, and I hear this all the time with successful people, usually for them, business is number one. And it always has been. And so there is a call, especially if that really aligns with a deeper purpose, right? Because it's not just business and success and money. Hey, we could like those things, but when you align success with true purpose, that's a whole nother ballgame, which is more like a calling. It's more like a mission in life, and nothing will disrupt you from that. And so whether that's relationships or kids or marriages or family or any of those things that might be more of these relational framework pieces, typically have to fall under that. And by the way, then it's also interesting because our negotiation of our value systems and people who are close to us in proximity interpersonally, say somebody like that had a spouse, they would have to have a spouse that could align with could also prioritize and see them being in that. Otherwise, inherently, there's going to be disruption in their life. It's going to cause a fissure in that relationship. And so lots of variables have to come into play to make that work. I think consciousness around our value systems is one of them. Do you align it with, or do a purpose and a drive, do both of those things, and a hierarchy around alignment? That is a deeper purpose that's going to almost differentiate and create a distinction where that purpose would offset everything else underneath it, which again is really common when you're successful. But again, this kind of question, does it emerge? What I notice happens is people think that they're okay with it, and then they reach a certain level of success. It's usually an extraordinary success. And then they're looking around and saying, what did I do all this for? And yes, are you changing the world? Are you making a huge difference? Yes, it's that inherently will be gratifying, but there is less personal gratification, because what I find is they reach a certain threshold where they take on more consciousness. It might have been a focus for a period of time, but when they've reached a certain level of success, then they're not as rewarded by those external factors, and they're not feeling close to anybody. Who do I get to celebrate this with? And it's such that isolation that I see that really exceptional people achieve, is they really feel lonely and they feel like no one's at their level to really understand the work they're doing or what they're going through or what they've become. They really don't relate to anybody because they've outgrown everybody. And by the way, they've probably neglected their relationships along the way. And so what I find is there's usually a period of time that they're in ignorant bliss about it because they're so focused on the mission. But once they've reached a certain threshold, I hope this is answering your question. Once they've reached a certain threshold, then what I find is they are longing for more. That's when they start questioning. And maybe it's because they've lost everything. And maybe it's just because they feel so unrelatable to anyone that they're looking for somebody who can really understand their experience, but also help them feel they might be surrounded by people, but they feel alone. And so that's a profound loneliness that a lot of leaders, executives, high performing individuals that I work with end up wrestling with at some point. It may not even be till later in their life or reaching a certain threshold. I mean, it's usually after they reach a certain threshold of success and then they look around and it's what is the purpose of it? Where's my gratification in all of this? And sometimes they find that that's missing.
Yeah. Ultra Rosie would call that the lonely chapter. And I think a lot of times people go through multiple. Ultimately, I wonder if you have a follow-up on that or any pushback in regards to the lonely chapter.
Go ahead. I keep going at this all day.
Yeah. Sure. No. So yeah, Casey, I got some thoughts. So I very much agree with everything you're talking about. From the vulnerability standpoint, I think for me, the way I think about that comes down to breaking down social constructs. I think when we grow up, we're bought into a system, and that's where those maladaptive behaviors rise from, I believe. But when you look at people like Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, and you talk about them being at their higher selves, these are people that don't believe in constructs at all. Steve Jobs was known to have the reality distortion field, where he would go to somebody and tell them they're able to do something that they absolutely thought was impossible. I put those people like in the top 0.1%.
Yes.
People who are absolutely changing the world and trying to save humanity, et cetera. But when you look at high performers, they'd say 90% of us, I think a lot of us think our ego is trying to head in that direction, that we are going to do something magnificent. And there's different levels to that, right? For me, example, sure, I want to touch the lives of many patients. I want to change the way medicine might be done. We have a podcast here for a reason. But I know that at the same time, there's going to be a point where I want to enjoy life. I want to, what I call live a full life, live with zest, build range, and really enjoy that external reward plus the internal reward of family, of relationships, learning new things, having great purpose at work. And it's funny because I've just wrote a Substack article on this about 5 days ago called The Monster You Create, right? And what I've started to realize is everyone at 20 to 30 years old, I'm 33. So luckily I've gotten perspective on this to at least think about it. But a lot of high performers want to work hard, make money. To what end? To eventually enjoy their life. And I think what Chris Williamson talked about is if all you know for 20 years is working hard to get to that point, once you get to that point, it's going to be hard to retire. It's going to be hard to let go of that monster you just created. And so when I look at Elon and Steve Jobs, for example, I think they're happy with those trade-offs to not be the best parent because they are trying to reach them higher selves. Whereas if you look at Kobe Bryant or maybe someone else, as long as these people are aware of that monster that they're creating and they're okay with that, I think that a lot of people just don't do that self-reflection, I find. But I don't know if you have any follow-up on that.
Yeah, I think you're touching, there is this kind of rare, high percentage of rare that are almost idiot savants. And their calling is so channeled in a particular, they couldn't not be that. And there are sacrifices that they would probably gladly make. And the disparity between those two levels in their hierarchy, in their personal reward, it's that actually may be the reward. And so who are we to say that? They can decide that for themselves. And I'm sure that many of those trade-offs, right? I think Elon Musk is a brilliant example of that. He is this idiot savant. And I think he's absolutely aligned with his purpose and feels like he has some other rewards and balances and personal things in his life. But there's a huge gap between those things and what he's generating in the world. And yeah, I think it is sort of seeing that distinction. And then you can feel the differentiation if somebody was great and extraordinary and the top of their field, but it may not reach quite that level. And so they have to look at some point. And I think it's really just asking yourself any question. Again, if we go back to the value system, and if you were to tell me that I want to be the greatest in my field, I want to influence people, to what end? I would really ask any high performer, any leader, any executive, any creator of whatever sort that they are doing. What do you imagine? Okay, great. We can entertain all of that. But what do you imagine you're going to experience when you've accomplished that? What do you imagine that's going to give you? And I think it's a really great question to understand what's truly the drive. And sometimes we're not conscious of what our true motivation and drive is. And we think that it's going to give something and it might be the ego that we're satisfying. And sometimes we don't actually need to go about accomplishing the certain things. It's, oh, I recognize once I do this thought exploration about what I imagined it would be, it could be anything. It could be a financial reward. Hey, I want to own a retreat center in Bali and serve all of the highest, or I want to, who knows what? I mean, just anything you could dream or imagine. You don't have to actually accomplish it. You can put yourself there and really then explore this option of understanding what you imagine you were going to have on the other side of that. And that can sometimes give you a lot of redirection and insight into, why do I want all the money? Why do I want all the success? Why do I want the fame? Why do I want you fill in the blank, whatever anyone's chasing? And is it really going to end up giving you congruence with the true values that you know, or do those need to be reorganized in some way because perhaps you weren't as insightful about your value system as you thought you were?
This is funny. If any of my friends or my wife are listening, they're just going to be laughing because it's almost like a live therapy session that I'm having here. I'm thinking about, as you guys are talking, right? So two separate thoughts. The first one that came to mind was Jim Carrey. I think maybe it was at the Golden Globes or something, where he gets up there and he has this joking. You guys seen this? Where he's like, "I'm Jim Carrey, 3-time or 4-time Golden Globe winner or something, and tonight I'll go to sleep. I'll dream about winning my 5th Golden Globe, and that's when I'm going to be enough." And the point that he's making is kind of like what you're talking about, right? Like, what happens when you get to that the peak of the mountain? Is it going to be enough? What are you going to feel like? Yeah. And then, Darsh, to your point about Steve Jobs, Musk, right? Versus the other 99.9% of people who are still, like, at least the high performers in the 99.9%. The problem is nobody's reading their biographies. And correct me if I'm wrong, like, you've read Jobs, you've read Musk, right? I don't read these biographies, but I'm also almost wondering if it's when we read these stories, if it's better to just read them as almost a fictional thing, as opposed to look at it like inspiring and, oh, I can do this. Because that's what most people are trying to do. Be like, okay, these are the lessons that I can extract and apply to my life, and I'll be one step closer. Whereas you're arguing that that's like, you shouldn't even approach the world in terms of your framework the same way. Am I kind of understanding that correctly?
Yeah. So the beauty of Walter Isaacson, right, the author of those biographies, is that's exactly how he writes them. He doesn't write them to motivate you. He writes it as, hey, this is the realistic picture of how these guys have gotten to their level. And these are the trade-offs that they had to do. These are the opportunity costs. And so it really just gives you a full spectrum picture of, like, you know, like, wow, Elon Musk, super inspirational. But do I want to be that type of person? Do I want to make the sacrifices that he has to live his type of life, right? And I think, Casey, as you said, it comes down to understanding your value system, right? And I talk about it as knowing the game you're playing. I mean, I talk to a lot of new resident grads, and it's all about understanding, like, what are you trying to chase? Is it to be a master? Is it that you want financial freedom? Do you want more lifestyle balance? And constantly having that conversation with yourself helps you with that next decision, you know, that at least aligns more with your goals.
And I would keep following that down even. Okay, I want financial freedom, but why? It's like, we haven't reached the end of, is this thing giving me what I imagine it's giving me? And many times what we'll find is what we think something is doing for us, it's not really doing that for us. It's not going to really deliver us to where we want to go. And so I think, I have not read those autobiographies myself, but so I think of it as this concept really of, if anyone is a mirror or a reflection to me, if I'm reading an autobiography about this person or I'm meeting this person in life, rather than evaluating myself against that, is really, what does it evoke in me? When I hear about what they're experiencing, what they had to go through, what does that evoke inside of me? What does that tell me ultimately about myself? And how does that help me to be more conscious about my own values? Not as a judgment of them or not as an aspiration to be like them if it doesn't align. It's what's really true for me. How do I learn to listen to what anybody, any mirror, any reflection could tell me is evoking inside me? And then do I take that on as wisdom and really do what the best I could with that to understand myself better? And I really think by living in alignment with ourselves and knowing ourselves deeply and moving in the direction of that alignment consistently with devotion to nothing else is the greatest gift that we can give to the world. And we might just arrive in some pretty amazing places and do some pretty amazing things.
So let's talk about cultivating peace then. right? How do we become someone who, rather than chasing peace or running away from something, running towards something, and just running, being busy? I'm thinking about Max Schenk talking about was it the badge of burnout, he called it? Certificate of suffering, badge of burnout. Rather than those who keep earning those badges, how do we become somebody who's actually cultivating peace rather than chasing it?
I think we feel peace when we align with our values. So it's going to seem like it comes back around to that. But when we really learn, I know it to be true. I think what we do in our value system when we are incongruent, when we are unconscious and we're not living in alignment, our reality doesn't match our ideals, is we are chasing impulse. And so we're driven by an impulsive thought. We want to give ourselves relief or fill some void in some way. And so we do it, and it might get us closer, but we end up feeling empty, or we end up still longing. We're still in this, I guess, void of unmet needs. And so we're in pursuit of those, but we're not really doing it. And so I think of this as being the difference between impulses and desires. And what I think we are meant to do is really chase our desires, which is where pleasure and joy and kind of these higher elevated emotions live. And to somebody who's exceptional or somebody who is moving in alignment with their value systems and making those congruent, sometimes that's really hard work. There is sacrifice. It's not to achieve this ultimate pleasure. It's like a simple analogy sometimes that I'll use with people, just on a grassroots one, is if I said that I wanted to be physically fit, but had chased the impulse of eating a pint of ice cream every night. That's incongruence. It's a silly example, right? But I might feel this instant gratification that I would get from eating this food, but I'm totally actually taking myself completely out of alignment. So these things on a polarity scale couldn't be more oppositional, right? Like desire and impulse are completely oppositional. And so if I were to say, hey, I'm going to actually work out and eat clean and eat whatever I might eat, right, in order to actually feel vital and healthy and strong and be the shape in my body that I want to be, that would be the harder path to do. But ultimately I would get more intrinsic pleasure from following that path. That might be the more challenging path. That might be the more disciplined. That might be the more sacrificial path. But I'm going to get the pleasure that I would extrapolate from that versus the pleasure from eating the food. There's no comparison, right? And most people don't have the devotion or discipline. Again, it's a silly example of that. But how do you apply that to absolutely anything? And so I think the distinction is differentiating between impulse and pleasure, impulse and desire, and really understanding that our pursuits, our devotion to ourselves and to our purpose and to our higher calling in life really has to be in pursuit of desire. And sometimes that means sacrifice along the way, whereas impulse is always going to give you something that's going to give you the dopamine hit, but it's not really going to lead to anything sustainable.
So not giving into your impulses can be painful. So on that note, I want to talk about pain and trauma.
Okay.
Something that short and sweet that I got from you, where you talk about pain teaches us what belongs to us and what does not. Say more about that one.
Yeah, I think it really is opening up this intimacy with self and understanding, again, our kind of biopsycho individual experience. And I think of trauma really it's not what happens to us, but it's how we make meaning of ourselves when it happens to us. And it's how we're held in the space of that, right? So if I'm just thinking about that psychologically, there's all kinds of pain, right? But really, I think of it as a language, a communication of deepening into relationship with ourselves. And how do I, again, remove the barriers of whatever would prevent me from knowing myself more deeply and aligning with that version of myself that would lead me to fulfillment and satisfaction and true happiness or peace in life, whatever it is that you're seeking. And so I think this understanding, to be able to differentiate, to meet your own pain in that way, where you understand, why did this hurt? What happened here? How was I not met? Why did this feel traumatic? Why is this pain even, if you're even looking at physical pain, why is it showing up in my body? What's it trying to communicate to me? If there's some, I think, disease and pain and disorder and all of those things that show up, I'd be curious to hear what your opinions are of that. But I think they're not separate, right, from our mental, emotional states, from our traumas, right? They're also interwoven, that there is a message in that. And so it's really, how do I understand what of it is mine and what of it I've inherited and what of it I've absorbed that I don't necessarily believe in or understand. Who am I and what do I believe about this? If I really got the opportunity to explore and examine that in a way that was true to me, and if I really listened to the cues and the unique bioindividuality of my own body, of my own mind, my own spirit, what would it have me know? And am I moving? Am I making space to really understand myself so deeply that I can let go of anything that doesn't belong to me, isn't mine, isn't what I would consciously subscribe to if I could see the difference? Does that make sense?
It does. Could you, how do you define trauma for people? That's a word that I feel has been perverted a lot. And so how do you use that word in in the general sense and then also maybe in the pathological sense?
Well, I think of, I mean, it's so how do you internalize the trauma? And so trauma is big trauma, little trauma. There is a spectrum of trauma of ways that we can experience that, and we absorb the pains and the hurts. And so I think of it as whatever that is for you is true and real. But are you over identified with that? I think so often we can get over identified and get locked into a victim consciousness, and victim consciousness is just going to create barriers to our exceptional life, right? So it doesn't mean that we weren't valid in being traumatized by whatever that could be. Again, is it a physical trauma? Is it emotional trauma? Is it a sexual trauma? Is you name what is the trauma? And if it feels traumatic to you, meaning you're unresolved, it's staying with you, your response to life and anything that then lives inside your nervous system is giving off this neuroception that, okay, well, I'm locked in this time. I'm time traveling back to this place and I can't escape it. And my world is colored by it. I can't free myself from the traumatic experience that I lived here. And so to me, I would say that then you have downloaded this as trauma, and now unconsciously you're moving through the world and seeing the world and experiencing it even in your nervous system, which is subcortical, of course, in a way that is not allowing you to be free to meet those things that are meet life and circumstances and people in a regulated way, because there's a distortion that has been laid on to the surface of that. And so I think it's our job to remove that distortion, but then the lens through which we see the world is tainted. The lens through which we see the world is we're not free. And so we're going into every single, and so our sense of reality is fragmented. Our sense of reality is distorted. And these traumas then stifle us from living more vitally, more presently, more in our center and more consciously, frankly, because it cuts us off from consciousness. And so I think it disallows us from really having some of those experiences that we would otherwise have. I hope that kind of answers that question, Britt. So it's going back, and sometimes those very subconscious traumas, we need to greet them and be held in such a way. And that's what we can't just keep driving out of it, right? It's like we're actually going to re-traumatize our nervous system, which is, again, subcortical. And so we don't have a choice around this, right? And if you keep pushing beyond a point that you've had a trauma, you're actually just re-traumatizing yourself, and you're re-entraining your nervous system to keep you in that traumatized state and in that nervous system dysregulation, whatever that state of dysregulation is for you. We see the world through the state that we're in. And if we don't repair the state that we're in and come back to present state all the time and remove those barriers, then we're going to struggle. We're going to find some way that our life is not, that there's dysfunction going on in our life, some part of us that is not optimal, some aspect of our life that, to circle back to the earlier conversation, that is not in harmony. And so that's our work to do.
Could you give an example of an instance where somebody would be pushing through that trauma and just re-traumatizing themselves?
And traumatizing, yeah. It could be, I'm trying to think of a very specific or just an invented example, but it's I'm trying to think of something really specific, but it would be in any way that your nervous system is telling you. Let's say that your nervous system is going into fight or flight, and that's the pattern you go into. So every time, whatever the trauma was, drives you into fight or flight. And so then you tell yourself, okay, if I go back and experience something similar, maybe it was, I had this injury. A lot of it's so mental, guys. It's like amazing how mental this can be, because we can tell ourselves, just push forward, go do that thing. But the more that we do that, we're going to reach a ceiling, and we'll keep going into that state where we're going into fight or flight every single time. And we can't escape it again because it's subcortical. The nervous system clicks on this is automatic. We don't have control or governance over it. It's not governed by the part of our brain, prefrontal cortex, that's going to allow us to decide consciously just to do it better. Now, can we, in some, and this is why even we would call it exposure therapy. It's like maybe you had a trauma, a silly example, like you were terrified of rattlesnakes or something. And we said, hey, here's exposure therapy. Let's just keep exposing you to rattlesnakes. All that's going to really do deeply. Maybe there's a threshold which some people can overcome that and say, oh, they're friendly now. And I'm not bothered by that. But usually what happens is we'll just re-imprint the fear deeper, but we'll actually get ourselves even more shut down in our nervous system. So yes, I might have shifted from fight or flight, and now I can sit here and look like I'm calm, but I'm actually in a freeze state, right? And so I'm recycling these patterns that it might look on the surface like I've become okay with rattlesnakes, but actually I've just become dissociated and gone into a freeze state so that I can tolerate staying here. So I pushed myself without actually understanding. If I were just to sit and really understand what about that was terrifying for me. And what about that is that bringing up? So if you slow down a little bit, right, it doesn't mean I'm not about coddling anyone or babying or anything like that. But what do we need to do in order to tend to the nervous system so that it's not just flopping around from different states? And am I settling into a more dysregulated state that on the surface might look calmer than when I was in fight or flight, but internally, what's actually happening to the nervous system? Am I really at peace with this? I'm sure there are some people, right, that can work for. But generally, if you really understand the nervous system, which, speaking to the choir, it's just going to shift you into frankly, a more dysregulated state around that might on the surface look one way, but internally, what's really happening in your neuroception, right? I don't know that is shifted that easily without truly repairing it in a meaningful way. Just pushing through. Would you agree with that? I don't know.
I think so. I'm also interested in what's happening between two people who at an earlier point in life could be exposed to the same little T trauma, yet maybe 10, 20 years down the road, at some point, let's just say through their childhood and then later through their adult life, have completely different phenotypes. For instance, you used the word resilience earlier, and I can tie back to our earlier conversation with somebody who's really highly ambitious, driven performer, etc. The same issue, whether it's maybe they grew up in a household where parents had an issue, actually, classic recent conversation with Brene Brown and Stephen Bartlett, them talking about both the similar households, shouting behind the walls, etc., and so on and so forth. And now, like they're in some way sitting on top of the pinnacle. What is it that will make somebody take that experience, that little T trauma, the same type, and matriculate it into something so meaningful, use that as obstacle, as inspiration, and be better, quote unquote, for it, at least outwardly, and then another person who is going to be completely dysfunctional and not get beyond that somehow.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think I love the word phenotype because I think so much of it goes back to the adaptive strategies. Like, what did we experience? How did we adapt to it? And I think, I don't know, there is something that is, again, ephemeral in our essence that comes through, that some of us just have a deeper sense of resiliency. I think some people are kind of like, if you think about them as a glass, like that you could, some are more crystal and fragile and some are, more solid and sturdy and can endure more. And same traumas, right? And frankly, somebody who is more sturdy could have gone through a lot more. And so how is that built and constructed along the way? And then what are the compensatory strategies that I develop? But also, all of those variables are so complex and multidimensional that allow us to take on. And it's funny because I work with a lot. It is frankly more interesting than anything, rather than somebody who's had very, silver spoon kind of life and then becomes really extraordinary. What I'm far more interested in is when that journey has been more complex and multidimensional. And I see it all the time with really exceptional people. It wasn't necessarily that they had everything that was easy, right? But they had all of these challenges that in our world, we call it post-traumatic growth rather than post-traumatic stress. It's like somebody can get locked into that. And I think it's also our unconscious, our ego's identity. It's like the things that we identify with. Some people really over-identify with their victimhood and with their challenges and with staying. And so there is kind of an exploration of what do you identify with and why? And is that really serving you or not? And I think sometimes people don't have a choice. I mean, again, there's so many variables that it's fascinating for me to dive into that and really see what drives somebody to become, in my world. I mean, this is what I had to learn about myself is I didn't know it until I was inside of it. And I really had to discover like, wow, I'm like really a seeker. I really, when there's a challenge, because my life was smooth until it wasn't, right? And so I had that opportunity. I saw that opportunity that's like, whoa, a lot of stuff is happening. And what do I do with that? And to be honest, I didn't know that that's what I would make of it until I was inside that space, right? But I think that's one of the most fascinating qualities. And frankly, it's no coincidence that those are the people that are drawn to me and my work, or people who are very similar, is they tend to want to dig in, do whatever it takes, figure it out, get to the bottom and keep going, right? It's like, just keep seeking no matter what. They're growth minded in life. They are seekers. They're not complacent in life. They are not wanting to be comfortable. It's always striving to be more. And I learned that at a certain juncture when I had my own challenges. And what I find is that people who are similarly wired tend to come and work with me, because otherwise it probably wouldn't be a great fit, because it's so much of the ethos and the deep unconscious value system that now, of course, is conscious for me of who I am. And so I want people who are not going to be over-identified with their victimhood, but are going to do whatever it takes to kind of overcome that and figure out what the heck is going on so that you can move past it. And I just think there are so many variables to that. Some of them, frankly, again, I think are almost mystical. Some of them are part of our design, that two people could have the same experience, but their phenotype is going to drive them to walk in this way where they're seeking, and others are going to be over-identified. And again, you always have to ask, there's always a secondary gain or reward in the mind for whatever choice they're making. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the best choice for them, but there is a secondary gain that they're getting. And so being over-identified with being, if I'm a martyr, or if I'm helpless, or if I'm wounded, or if I'm weak in some way, and I want somebody to, how am I utilizing that as a tool? If I've over-identified with my victimhood, how am I utilizing that as a tool that might be working, right? Again, like there is some gratification in that for them. It's not really ever going to reach them to their aligned value system or their most enlightened self, or probably their greatness. It will keep them separate from that for all space and time until they change that, until they make a new decision around what they truly desire. But many people, it's no confusion about the fact that I would say most people choose that. They get stuck at a certain level of that and don't transcend. Does that answer your question? What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, good, Alt.
No, I do agree. I think it gets to be really difficult. The analogy that you used with respect, or the metaphor rather, for the different types of glass, this is that nature nurture thing. Some of it is, I think it's hardwiring for sure. It's genetic. I think a lot of it also, there is some part of resilience where you used the word coddling earlier. And as somebody who has a child and takes parenting very seriously, this concept of, I don't know where I heard it, but the way that I was raised as an immigrant coming from a Southeast Asian household versus how I'm raising my kid is very different. And you try to, I promise I'm going to connect this. You try to learn about what gentle parenting, quote unquote, means. And there's I think a very fine but very clear line between gentle parenting and permissive parenting. Because the reality is, I don't know, that you can go too far by not trying to, quote unquote, pass on these generational traumas. I know I'm skipping topics here, but I do think that a lot of times parents and just people in general who have suppressed them for a long time, like you're talking about, maybe you think that you become resilient. Maybe these are obstacles and hurdles, and you wear this badge or certificate of suffering, as I was saying earlier. And then you are, quote unquote, re-traumatized later on when you're exposed to a little person who you're responsible for. You're like, oh shit, okay, this is where I'm, like, where's that coming from? Why am I so triggered by this specific situation? And then maybe you sit, right? You think through what's actually happening and you figure out deeper level, oh, okay, it's coming back to me now. But then you got to be really careful because now you can't, because the initial instinct as a parent is to, oh, I don't want to pass this on. I don't want it to be the same. I want to be better. And you could go the other extreme, right? And now you won't build resilience. You won't build something called frustration tolerance that I take from Dr. Becky Kennedy. And I think that's really important too. Again, it might have been from Becky Kennedy where I heard her. She was like talking about how sometimes building resilience in kids is important. For instance, I think she might have said that she wants to put her kid in a martial arts thing or something like that when there's nobody to save them. And then if another person comes, punches in the face and they look at you to be like, hey, save me. And you're like, no, go figure it out. Sometimes that's good for you. And I say that a little bit tongue in cheek, but I think there's some merit to that, like where you can help carve resilience in people by exposing, like exposure therapy, right? Stress tolerance and distress tolerance are they're a very real thing. I think that if that amount of stress is overwhelming and it's more than you have capacity to deal with, it can traumatize you and leave you incapacitated for a long time. And so as somebody who is in a role who can potentially dose his stress, and things come up where you can facilitate the process of your child by, okay, let me do this for you. Let me do that for you. Let me give this to you. Let me do that for you. You don't build that resilience. You don't build that distress. Right. It's tough. And I think maybe that's why we spend so much time talking about this. But this is something that like it bothers me a lot. I suppose because there are really no right answers to it, and there are multiple points of view. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Yeah. Agreed. Well, I mean, I love just the fact that you're so deeply contemplating and exploring all of that. It already tells me that as a parent, right, you're probably right on the right track. And there is going to be some just deep contemplation that you're exploring. And it's not really, it's not about the destination. It really is the journey of that, I believe. And in the way that you can be vital and present with that, and everything we've talked about, so far really allows us to do that in a way when we become parents, even if we haven't reconciled or rectified all of those traumas, or if we're consciously trying to choose to do something differently, we're more available when we do this in ourselves. And inherently having a child and rearing them and having them go through some of these developmental milestones that probably are living inside our own nervous system and memory field, right, unconsciously or consciously, right, is going to allow you to see how to, and I think it's just that relation. It's like, how do you meet it along the way and know so you don't get into a pattern of overfunctioning, underfunctioning, or success and atrophy and some of these dynamics, right? It's like, I think, again, we're so psychosocial, spiritual individual that you have to meet that soul, that child, and really understand what do they need, to your point. And I'm glad actually that you brought up genetics, because I think epigenetics can influence so much of our trauma response and what we carry. And there's so much more science now to understand that we can inherit generations of anxiety or stress or depression that live in the people that we inherited our genes from. And so that's an important piece to know too. But it's also, okay, how do I attune to you as this unique child? And this is where really, I believe you can have multiple children even. I don't know how many children you have you can have, and they can all have a different experience. And that's because they're bringing their own unique epigenetics and then their own unique just essence, right? That how is that shaped and formed? And how do I attune that to this child versus this child that may be different, even though they have the same two parents and the same two circumstances? It's like in actuality, they don't. And how do I attune to each individual? And this is why I'm so big on emphasizing this bio-individuality. It's like you can see that your child just comes out and they already have an essence. Personality is formed, and there's things that we can do to shape and help them to become more resilient without pushing them too far. Because if we push them too far, if we just throw them, oh, hey, without guidance, I think that's what really great parenting is. We create a container so that they can become the best version of themselves. And if that never happened for us, then how do we really truly understand what a container looks like that allows them to reach the edges and push out and become who they're meant to be versus who I need them to be for me, and all of those things. And it's like, how do I actually help them just to become who they are and the best version of themselves, and some of these qualities and traits that, yes, I value, but also how do I work with that so that they can harness that leading edge and develop more resiliency? And I think there are ways that we can do that effectively without being too harsh or pushing too hard or leaving them out to without any guidance at all, if that makes sense.
Casey, do you find people at a certain age where they're able to start building that resilience, or at least start breaking down their trauma? Because the reason I ask, if we're talking about this contrast between people who are very resilient and become successful and can work through it versus those who quote unquote become dysfunctional, I almost think that you need enough life experience to even understand the trauma that you had. For example, me growing up, I had a lot of trauma, a lot of anxiety growing up. I developed a stutter 6th grade all the way up to age 22, 23. We'll tag this in with the body keeps the score, right? I'm sure that's what happened. But I got to a point when I was 23, 24, where I developed a lot of confidence in myself. I realized what I could offer the world, and I developed a theme, right? And I knew the game I was playing essentially. And so through that confidence, I was able to make sense of whatever that trauma was, right? I was able to tame it in a way and say, okay, this is why this is generational, or this is why my parents did XYZ, or my friends did this. And I was able to just understand it. So going back to that initial question, is there really a time frame where you're seeing the people that come to you being able to understand that? Do you need enough life experience to understand what's going on?
I'll say this. I typically work with people who are adults but I have had a few kind of very gifted teenagers that I've worked with that have followed me, because people will also stay with me once they begin. So I certainly walk that path with some younger people. And I do think kids and teenagers, there's almost this day and age, even compared, and I'm probably older than both of you, but they are, just wiser, older souls just from the get-go, right? So I think sometimes there's a space for them to learn those things faster or be tapped into a greater wisdom sooner. And I also think there's a lot of division and all of that too. But I do think there is something with age and wisdom that comes along, right? And I think of it the way that I would conceptualize it is like we all come with our own perspective, and which is built up from our traumas, our experience, our history, our view of the world, our nervous system. Everything informs our perception of the world. And we all have a unique perception. And oftentimes our perception is usually not as wise as when we get perspective. And what we ultimately want to get is perspective, right? Which is really, in my mind, when you understand, I can understand, to your point about your parents or where this came from or why this developed, you can get a greater wisdom, and whatever allows that, I'd be fascinated to hear what that was for you that allowed you to garner that greater wisdom and that greater perspective, which allows you to not just see the world as you are, but as what is from that person's eyes, or this higher, what would be the purpose and all of that? And can I hold this kind of emotional intelligence of all the things, not just my perception of the world? And my perception is going to stifle me because it's inherently limited. I only know as much as I believe and understand, and am limited to those beliefs. But I think inherently, like, these two things go hand in hand, right? Wisdom and age. And so it's harder to get that. But it's not to say that someone couldn't have that as a younger soul, right? As a teenager, like, great. I admire that you even got it when you were in your early 20s, right? Because that, I think, is earlier than a lot of people get it. I have people who start this work in their 60s. I have people that start this work in their 80s. I have people that start this work and feel like it's too late. It's never too late. It's really when you can click into a higher, and you understand that life isn't just my perception of it. And my perception is actually limiting me to having a greater experience in life. And so I would like to get more perspective, which is true wisdom, right? I might know a few things, but knowledge isn't wisdom. And so whatever age we get that, I think, again, inherently, those are intrinsically linked between age and wisdom, but I think it can happen at any time. And it's what in your life can arise that would evoke that experience to happen for you. And I would imagine there was a catalyst, right, that allowed you to get that perspective. And I know there was for me. Usually that's what I see is like something, and sometimes it's really challenged. Sometimes it's really, I'm glad to hear it sounds like for you that a lot of it was confidence and developing a deeper, but a lot of people do it through adversity. Like, they are having a challenge, life is not going as they want, and they finally have to say something about this is not working for me. And so how do I optimize? How do I really re-examine everything to get to where I want to be?
Yeah, absolutely. So that leads me into a book that is on my list that I haven't read yet, but it's called The Body Keeps the Score, right?
Oh, yeah, you got to love it.
Yeah. So you've got a quote here that says, you can't outthink your trauma. Tell us
right. Yeah. Simply put, I think it's also the difference between, intelligence and wisdom. Like, you can't out-talk it. You can't because that just re-imprints. Like so often, and what a lot of traditional psychotherapy does, or therapy, right, is they'll just kind of talk, and what they're doing is they're re-imprinting the victim consciousness. It Our trauma lives in our body on all levels, and which is again subcortical, the nervous system. It communicates. We get these deep imprints that live inside of us around our trauma, and so if we just keep talking about it, I think we can actually do a lot of damage by imprinting it deeper into our nervous system. And frankly, it's this identification with our victimhood that we can't just intellectualize these problems and be solved. It's really about the embodiment, and we're not free unless we're free on all levels of our being. And so if your nervous system and this neuroception that's happening as you're perceiving the world because you've had a threat or a trauma in the past doesn't allow you to perceive the world differently, again, we see the world through the state that we are in. And if you're in a dysregulated state, which is subcortical, we don't have control over it. So I could be fine, and then something could happen. I had a client who was just talking about this the other day. She is staying at home with her parents at this time. Something happened where, they were moving some furniture. A door she perceived was slammed. And because of her trauma from the past, and, I'm in a family session where everyone's there and the parents are there and we're talking about it, right? And she went into an absolute mental breakdown because this door was slammed in her perception of the world. And so, but then as everyone's debating the semantics of what happened, it's the parent is saying the door wasn't slammed. And it's none of this is the point. Her perception of the world is telling her. And what it did is it threw her, a perfectly regulated person before that moment. But she hears that. And because of her trauma, it puts her into a state that she didn't choose. She didn't want to be there. She, hated being there, but she didn't know how to get past it. Right. And so how do we really understand that there are so many of these variables, and in life and in our world, we're exposed to so many variables that are out of our control in our circumstance that are going to evoke that same trauma response that's going to come up. And I always say, real or imagined, it doesn't matter. Your perception is telling you this thing that's putting you into an altered state that's not allowing you to perceive the world clearly. And so you're going to perceive the world as a dangerous, threatening place, and you're going to experience things that may or may not actually be happening the way that you're perceiving them accurately. And we can't help that until we kind of slow down and really tend to those parts. And so if we just talk about it, I always say awareness is the first step. So if somebody's not aware of that, then I would walk them through all of that. I would explain, the different states of the brain and how this is how it travels up. You're having this neuroception that's traveling up through the brainstem and is eventually reaching here. But if it's getting cut off at the place that's telling me you're in danger, then I can't reach the part of my brain that's rationalizing and saying, oh yeah, well, maybe he didn't really slam the door, or maybe again, and it's a silly example, but it's, a real one I was just talking about. So it's okay, so I need to provide the psychoeducation so that you understand even how the nervous system and the brain works. That's valuable. But we're going to get locked there if we just, you keep having those experiences or you're perceiving threat. Now we need to understand, how do we tend to that part that's perceiving the threat that's not even reaching the prefrontal cortex and the reasoning center of the brain in the first place. So the psychoeducation and intellectualization of well, why did that happen? And did it really happen? And was it really a door slam, or was it really that can only take us so far. And then we really have to examine, what is it that happened that I am so thrown off that my state could go from perfectly regulated and receptive to the world to completely dysregulated. And frankly, having what her words was like a mental breakdown. And so how do we go from those two things? Well, we have to tend to that, because she's not choosing to have a mental breakdown, right? She's not choosing to feel that way and dysregulated about that for as long as she was, and stuck in that and perceiving her dad as a threat who isn't really actually a threat, but this thing is all. Does this make sense? So I think it's important to, have awareness, and which is just what the kind of intellectualization would be. Hey, I need to explain, if you didn't understand all of this already, well, this is how it works. And then what would we do in order to tend to that, so that we can get you back to a receptive state? Because we see the world through the state we're in. And if you're in a dysregulated state, then your perception of everything is going to remain tainted. you will never get perspective. You will never get above where I can actually see like, oh yeah, maybe he didn't slam the door, or oh yeah, maybe that was an accident, or maybe he, like that wasn't really a threat, or I'm never going to get to that place where I have true perspective if I don't get regulated again.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So then take us into somatic body work then. So on Instagram, I'll see people doing like myofascial release, there's breath work. Take us through a little bit about quantum healing. Does that also go hand in hand with this too?
I think it does, because I just really think about quantum healing to me is like we are time traveling and we are in different, like when, just as an example, to go back to this gal, it's okay. When the door slams, she's not in the present time and space anymore. She's traveled. And so she's time traveled back to when she experienced that threat or that danger that probably was an audible one for her in that time and space. And so for me, I just really think there's all this entanglement that's happening. And again, it really depends on the state that you're in. And a lot of it can be inner child work. There's so many ways to go about. I don't think there's one way that works for everybody. And I don't think there's one right way to do it. But it's really getting back, it's connecting when we're doing healing. It's connecting the body with whatever this experience or this imprint is. And how do we find out where it lives? And I always just call it tracking the energy. So the way I do it, which isn't necessarily a way that is some specific training of how to do it, but I think, how do you go inward? How do you connect with where this trauma is living in your body when you experienced it? And then we can gather data about it. And then really, I think the things that we're looking for in that moment when we're tracking the energy, which maybe it may be anxiety, it may be a pit in my stomach, it may be my hands are sweating, it may be that I got a splitting headache, whatever that is for you, we're just going to track it and follow it when it happened. And it's that combination of things that I think you'll find, even as you reflect in your own kind of history with that or your own work, that combination is when real disorder, disease, dysfunction takes root. And so when that hasn't been done well, then that's what needs to happen. And so it's just taking a little bit of space. And sometimes it's a moment. Sometimes it's just, it's literally, the best word for it is attention. How do we attune and put attention on it until it can pass? And sometimes that's all it needs, and it's brief, and it doesn't have to be this big saga, and doesn't have to be this big crazy healing thing, but we're going back and we're tending to the version of you that got stuck in that place. And that's what we're doing, right? That's what it would look like. And then if we track the energy, and I do that, let's say there was some anxiety that you were feeling in your heart. And then we do that, and whatever comes up, maybe it's a memory field, maybe it's attunement that we just need to sit and put attention on the anxiety itself in the heart. Maybe, a thought comes up or a memory, or it's like my job when I'm tracking people through that is just to be present with whatever comes up. I'm not in control of it. I'm just creating a container so that whatever is meant to unfold in that particular part of the body, because that's the somatic experience of it, we want to stay there as long as we need to until that feels like it shifts. And how we know it shifts is it probably goes to another part of the body now. And so this isn't usually just a one-time, okay, well, the anxiety in the heart and that's it. It's like what you're going to notice. I guess I can only speak from experience. What I notice is that now it shifts, and now I notice I have a tingling in my fingers, or now I notice that my leg is numb, or now I notice, and it just keeps moving. And every stage, we don't rush it, but we just stay exactly with what that is until it shifts and it goes to another place. And we just keep doing that until we get to the bottom. And then what we also notice is each place in our body is probably holding a different experience. It's probably holding a different trauma, or it's probably holding a different story or narrative or pattern, right? And so if you stay with those, then you start to notice, like for me, I have suffered with migraine headaches for a lot of my life. And so it took a long time for me to decipher what the meaning of that was. And exactly like when that happens and I can feel that coming on, sometimes there can be a few different sources of that for me. But now I know exactly, it's like, this is the message that's coming through that's exactly true and specific to me. Somebody else might have migraine headaches and they would have a different message or a different truth. But for me, I've been able to track that so that it doesn't mean I won't ever have another migraine in my life. But it does mean that I can, number one, stave it off, and I have a lot less of them than I've ever had. They're significantly diminished. But it also means that I know when that happens, what is trying to be communicated to me on all levels of my being. That's what I do in short, in essence, is I kind of hold people with that. And we really can collapse time and space. And really that's what quantum is. That's what any somatic healing is we can erase any of that and bring it all into the present moment, because I can be time traveling over there in the past, I can be in the future, I can be in any place. And really, how do I synthesize that into the present moment so that I can carry that through? And I'm not living in the past anymore, and I'm not living in the future, but I can be in the present, and I can be fully vital and alive in my body without all of these things that are distracting me or pulling me out of my center or not allowing me to feel full and whole and healthy and healed. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. No, and I appreciate you answering my question, because that's exactly where I wanted to go. I wanted to learn about how somebody would embody that, right? Rather than just fight it constantly. You use the appropriate term, intellectualize, and I just call it mental masturbation, because that's what I think it ends up being for a lot of
Yeah.
people. And
Yeah.
to steal two concepts from Chris Williamson, he talks about, I guess he says something to the tune similar to what you said: you can't outthink a feeling problem. And for people, particularly who are more above the neck oriented, this highly intellectual, cerebral, left hemisphere type folks,
Which is also a compensatory strategy, by the way.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. Like, you're constantly trying to problem solve, like what I was talking about with the Tim Ferriss quote earlier. And it worked. It served you well in so many other areas of life, because we're coming back full circle. I found that sometimes just exactly, maybe not necessarily paying attention to different facets, but just bringing it back inside. For instance, there was a time that I remember going through a period of grief of having lost someone or a relationship ending, and just thinking about, man, this really sucks. Just sitting there and just really sucks, just repeating it until I could feel, and where I was on the borderline of crying. And that's hard, because it almost feels like you're wasting time, right? Somebody who's just kind of goes, okay, how do I become productive? How do I make lemonade out of this situation, so to speak?
Yep.
So that brings me to this last concept that I want to get your thoughts on. And maybe it'll relate to the beginning part with that insecure overachiever. Again, another concept from Chris Williamson, like that high performer, where you are given circumstances. Maybe it's those earlier life traumas that have shaped you. They've been repressed emotion at this point, and you are trying to change your circumstances for the better, right? Mm-hmm. Versus, and that might even include changing yourself. We used the word wisdom a couple of times, and with age and wisdom experience. And you recognize that, okay, maybe these things aren't serving me, and you want to change yourself. Much like anything else, sorry, go ahead.
I said I would hope so. Yeah, that's it.
I think much like anything else, though, this is also something that can be taken too far. So if you are perseverating over reading self-help books all the time and constantly changing, constantly fixing yourself, constantly being in therapy over and over again, and you're like, I got to fix me, that could be taken too far. And so I think that the concept of acceptance in some regards is really important. Somebody once taught me the term radical acceptance as well, and how to apply that in some sense. So how do you think about the tension between those two things, where the appropriate change, which is what we've been talking about a lot, versus also accepting that, hey, maybe some of this is okay. Maybe this is me, and I'm okay with being this version of me.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And again, it's going to be it's really hard. I think it's feeling into, I think so often what we're looking for in therapy and healing and whatever word you want to put around this is a felt sense, right? It's not the destination necessarily, but the language I use around it is a felt sense. And so sometimes, it's mystical, it's intangible, but there is a feeling of, okay, am I shifted? Am I content? Am I discontent? Do I need more? Am I just seeking to seek, right? Have I made my healing journey compensatory strategy, and I'm never really arriving, but I'm just using it as a distraction to not actually feel or not actually accept some circumstance in my life? I think it's really so personal, and what we are looking for, what I'm looking for typically is this kind of ephemeral, intangible quality of a felt sense. Or can you shift into a felt sense of whatever it is that you're trying to palpate? Is it peace? Is it happiness? Is it joy? Is it acceptance? What is the consciousness of that thing alone? And can I really ask myself and honestly answer, have I acquired that? Or is there more to do? Is there something that's not allowing me to arrive in that place, or to come back to that place and feel home in that often enough? And can I accept this circumstance? Or I think we are really not victims of circumstance. We're victims of our own mind. And so, of our own belief, of our own perspectives. And so, have I moved? And I have, and I think that it goes back even the way that I would just create a distinction is, am I still stuck in my perspective about anything where I can look down at myself? I can acknowledge that this happened, this trauma happened. I can't change this circumstance. And is my belief about it, or is the way that I've conceptualized it preventing me from really? And so does that put me into a striving or a constantly seeking or a never ending, like, okay, well, I'll pursue this now, I'll pursue this. I think it's a great question. And really the felt sense is I think when we arrive, when we're seeing the world not through our own perception, but from our perspective, there's an inherent piece that comes with that, because we can't accept why something happened or where it came from or somebody else's perception and perspective. Like we can absorb all of that, and then we can move past it in a way that we're not stuck. It's not stifling us. And so I think that though is a felt sense.
Yeah. I think that's the beauty of this, right? I think it's the beauty of these conversations is that whether you work in the field, us three do in the medical and healthcare field, or we're seeking our own journeys, the answer is unknown. And so I think it's this constant movement, doing the work, doing the somatic body work, doing the reflection, that we all try to just understand what this world's about and how we fit in with it. With that,
Right.
Casey, I just want to say thank you so much for being generous with your time. I think our listeners will love this conversation. If they want to learn more about you or they want to get in contact with you, where can they go?
Yeah, you can just find me on social media or my website at shrinkbigger.com or at shrinkbigger or Casey Stevens. It'll probably come up there too. So.
Awesome. And we'll put those in the show notes for easy access. And then the last question, Casey, that we ask everyone is, how do we put the health back into healthcare?
Well, I think really by just my greatest belief is the greatest activism that we can do is heal ourselves. And if we really take that on, with a devotion to ourselves, then I think we heal. It's just, we change everything. We change our relationships. We change our lives. We change the world by really doing that. And so how do you really think about, question, what is health for you? Are you living in alignment with that? And how then would you move to organize those things that aren't in alignment with that? And I think by doing that for ourselves, we do it. We inspire. I mean, it's such a ripple effect, and that's how we change the world.
Love it. Thanks, Casey.
Yeah, I hope
Cool.
that will be useful for your audience. You guys are great. So I really appreciate chatting with you.